So the Democratic Alliance will this weekend hold its first ever policy conference that since its inception. Delegates are expected to decide on the values and principles of the party and also to discuss race, redress and racial discrimination. Now, ahead of his resignation last year, former DA leader Mmusi Maimane called for a policy conference to discuss the party's approach to race, a recommendation that was adopted by the DA's Federal Council. You'll also remember that its head of policy, Gwen Ngwenya, resigned from that position just last year because she felt that the DA did not take policy seriously and that her unit was understaffed and without budget. Let's get you a preview now of the various issues related to the DA story, including a run-up to that conference. We're joined now by social commentator Tessa Dooms. Good morning, Tessa. Thanks very much for your time on the AM report this morning. I think, going into a policy conference of this nature, the first of its kind for the DA, with all of this background noise, how does the party even begin to decide on an agenda?
I think the party needs to be very clear as it goes into this policy conference that it does not have the kind of standing in society where its only issue is that it's not in governance. The party, for the first time, perhaps in all of its history, is more transparent to the voting public than it's ever been before in terms of some of its background noise, as you call it, or some of its behind-the-scenes issues in terms of its leadership questions, but certainly in terms of the party not necessarily all singing from the same hymn sheet when it comes to approaches to big policy questions like racial redress, like the question around unity in the country and where we go in terms of race and other marginalizations. And it would be in the party's best interest this weekend, as the country looks at it, to have what would be an honest conversation rather than one that just expedites a process to rubber stamp its own views or those of the policy units.
And one wonders whether that honest conversation is taking place behind closed doors, because you don't get a sense that when media interviews are done that you are getting the bare bones of what was happening, behind closed doors, so to speak. I mean, we spoke to Mike Moriarty yesterday on the show in the wake of John Moody leaving the DA, a very emotional John Moody. But then John Steenhuisen yesterday says, he is playing the race card, that is John Moody, and he was running away from accountability in terms of trying to smear another MP in a jobs for sex scandal.
And I think that the DA would have done better in this case particularly to not only address the issues that they are wanting to focus on in terms of these charges, but also address the long list of things that John Moody did put onto the table. Firstly, highlighting that there are many people in the party that face charges at the moment and that he believes that there's a political motivation behind the way in which disciplinary charges have been used. And there are examples in the DA's history where you see charges being put up against black leaders in the DA that won't have the same kind of implication for somebody like Helen Zille. These are the kinds of things that the party needs to become more forthright about and needs to address more openly. John Moody speaking to a culture in the party of silencing voices that want to have the conversation about race. This would be the perfect time for the DA to address that very directly and say where they stand on race and say what the party's internal culture on these things are. I just feel like the DA is missing an opportunity to actually be upfront with the voting public and say, yes, we have challenges. These are the challenges we have. And policy conferences are a good place for us to go out and battle those out and be robust in the way that we engage so that we have a unified position, rather than just focusing on the charges that John Moody has, because that just looks like they're trying to deflect in as much as they claim that he's trying to deflect.
Because it's not enough for the party to just say on paper, quote, we are an inclusive party for a new South Africa. I'm just paraphrasing some of what our interview with the DA, the Gauteng leader, the Gauteng chairperson had to say yesterday, Mike Moriarty, and how much of the party's identity is inextricably linked, from what we've seen over the past months and years, to Helen Zille, not least of which how the party has dealt with a number of things she said in the public domain the latest thing that she's now facing disciplinary action for, that tweet saying that there were more racist laws now than there were under apartheid?
I think Helen Zille's role is an important one, not only because of the person of Helen Zille, but certainly because of what Helen Zille represents in the public's imagination. And initially when she came into the party, Helen Zille represented somebody who had some kind of links to struggle credentials and the liberation movement. She represented somebody who was aggressively trying to change the face of the DA and bring in faces into the DA that showed on the outside what they were talking about as a party on the inside. And as we've seen it come along, people are now saying, well, Helen Zille represents only two things: Helen Zille's own interest or the interest of a white faction in the DA that's trying to cling to the DA's former base. And that, again, is something that needs to be addressed when Helen Zille is now the federal chairperson and occupies a very, very prominent part of the public imagination. It's no wonder that John Moody spent as much time as he did speaking about Helen Zille, because he knew that public tensions around Helen Zille will get a lot of attention, will get people talking, and that's not good for the DA. Having somebody who is now seen as a divisive character that is the face of your party for all intents and purposes is really not something that you want when there are big policy issues on the table and you're 1 year out of an election while you're in the middle of a leadership crisis.
And is it just that, Tessa? Is it just bringing in faces of what you think the voting public would like to see?
Well, for the DA part, there's been a lot of faces that we've seen come into the picture and questioning about whether those faces have actual power. So if we think back to the days of Alindiwe Mazibuko, we saw somebody who was not only a face of the DA, but somebody who had a long-standing history with the DA, that seemed once she became somebody who spoke very much on her own terms about her views, somebody who engaged on what she believed the DA is and what the DA should become, that somehow she fell out of favor with the party and is no longer there. So you cannot, you cannot overlook that. We cannot have a DA or opposition party that's just about putting the right faces in the right places, that is willing to bring in people who are not exactly aligned with their values, who haven't traditionally been DA for expedience, and then after the fact turn around on those very same people and say, well, those people weren't DA people anyway. You can't have it both ways. You have to either have a substantive commitment to a transformed party where your long-serving, aligned, value-driven people that you claim are part of the DA can actually emerge in the party under meritocracy or not. But you can't have it both ways.
Tessa Dooms, as always, a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much for coming onto the AM report. And that's, of course, as we build up to this first ever policy conference of the DA, where race and redress, among other issues, are set to be quite high up on the agenda.